Prize is the pinnacle of science. And there are three kinds of scientific authority. Why do we take science seriously? One is epistemological authority. How should we think about the world? How should we think about reality? Well, science is one epistemological approach to reality. Ontological, what is the nature of reality? What is really out there? And the third is normative, what is the right thing to do? And economics is essentially a normative kind of science in two senses. One is it tells us what is the right way to think about the economy. You'd think there's only one way, but I think the Brexit debate shows us there are a variety of ways of thinking about the economy. The second is how to choose, both as individuals and as a society. And the Nobel Prize validates the scientific authority of economics. Economics, usually academics are fairly retiring people and mostly talk with each other, but economics is one of the few disciplines that actually aspires to tell us what to do, how to manage our lives. But what authority does it have? How does it know? Why should we believe it? The Nobel Prize in economics defines the pinnacle of the discipline. This book takes us up to 2005. I will talk a bit about what happened after that, but the book takes us only up to 2005 for several different reasons. And at that point, there are 57 winners, and one can regard them as consisting of a high-quality sample of economics. If we ask what is economics, and let us take a sample, that's as good a sample, I suppose, as you can take. Now, this prize in economics is rather a latecomer. It was first awarded in 1969, which is, did you say 50 years ago? Very soon?
Years, yeah.
Yes, very soon. It was established almost exactly 50 years ago, in May 1968. That was when it was announced to the world. So, now the other Nobel Prizes in physics, chemistry, medicine, and literature have been awarded since 1901. So this is the only second thought kind of Nobel Prize.
Peace? What about peace?
Sorry?
You've forgotten peace.
We'll leave peace to one
Okay,
side.
sorry.
It's awarded in Norway, and it certainly has no epistemological, ontological, or normative authority. Maybe normative. So you've seen this list of disciplines: physics, chemistry, medicine, and literature. What kind of science is economics? Is it more like physics, or perhaps it's more like literature? If that sounds unlikely to you, well, economics is difficult, but literature can also be difficult. Samuel Beckett, who received the prize in 1969, is not an easy read. So let's leave the question on the table. What is the validity of economics? Economics has a kind of core, and in that core are two premises. One is the idea of methodological individualism. The economy is driven by personal choice and personal choice alone. In exchange, personal choice exercising, personal choice acting in unfettered markets, in market exchange, and so that's a principle of self-interest. The other core premise is that these private choices scale up to an efficient general equilibrium, and that's the invisible hand. In ideal condition, it scales up to a good state for society. Economists would say the best state for society. We don't need to worry about it because it never happens. So the common good is defined as the aggregate of individual choices. There are all sorts of other ways you could think about the common good, but that's the way economics invites us to think about it. Is that valid? How seriously should we take this? If we're not card-carrying PhDs in the discipline, how seriously should we take these claims? in what sense could we think it's valid? Well, there are two senses. One is the question of internal validity. The conclusions make sense and are consistent with the premises. So we start with the premises and we see whether the conclusions are consistent with them. That's internal validity. The other is external validity. Are the premises reasonable? And do the premises accord with observation, or do they predict it successfully? So that's internal validity and that's external validity. What sort of science is economic science? By the way, the name of the prize, everyone says it's not a Nobel Prize, it's the Bank of Sweden Prize in memory of Alfred Nobel. Why it's called that, you have to read the book to discover. I call it a Nobel Prize. It's as good as a Nobel Prize for pretty much every practical purpose. So let's think of it that way. But it is called the Prize in Economic Science. So what kind of science is that? Well, let's look at what science is about. In natural science, the test of theory is how well it justifies belief. This is how well it justifies belief. This is called justification. So a theory gives us good reasons to believe it. The good reasons are that when we look out of the window, that's the way the world looks, more or less the way the theory describes it. And here I invoke Richard Feynman, who is one of the great scientists, also a Nobel Prize winner in physics this time. This picture is taken out of a film. I always try to make that film work, but it never does, which is a shame. And so he gives these lectures in 1964. He gets a prize a year later, and he says, what is a physical law? Compare a hypothesis directly with observation to see if it works. Compare a hypothesis directly with observation to see if it works. If it disagrees with experiments, it's wrong. In that simple statement is the key to science. And he also waves his hands a bit when he does this. So he is quite willing to say that a scientific theory can be wrong. In natural science, theory is confronted by evidence. Now, what about economics? Does economics confront theory with evidence? Well, some of the time. How much? Well, now I need to show you where this graph comes from. So, this graph is one of the research techniques that we used in this book. This is counting citations. So we develop a method for counting citations. The scale is arrows. Arrows is citations controlled for the size of the population of citations. So because the scientific literature expands substantially over this period, you have to control for that. So we did that, and we called it arrows because Kenneth Arrow, for the period we covered, had the most citations in a single year. So we said that will be 100, and so everyone else is less than that, 100 per year, I should say. And so we follow this from 1970 to 2005. And we've divided the economists into two groups. One is called formalists. Formalists never look out of the window. They just make it up in a very clever way, but that's essentially what they do. The empiricists are more enterprising. They also innovate. You cannot just get a Nobel Prize for looking out of the window, as it were. You have to come up with some twist. But nevertheless, they also engage with empirical work. And so you can see that, at any rate, among Nobel Prize winners, I would say that both the citations and the numbers of empiricists is somewhat larger, but not a So they more or less go together, they more or less match, there's some kind of balance. And by the end, about halfway through the period, they converge on each other, and by some miracle, they seem to go shoulder to shoulder. The curves are the cumulative citations in the field, and the cumulative citation just of Nobel Prize winners. And the dots are when they got the prize. And in the Nobel lectures, they talk the talk of empiricism. So 20 lectures mention the word confirmation, sometimes many more times than once. 12 of them talk about verification. 5 of them are more sophisticated and talk about falsification. I should say confirmation is completely verboten in the philosophy of science. That's not a kosher way of doing science, but scientists don't always know exactly how they're supposed to do science, or indeed how they're doing science. So there's quite a lot of talk, but even if you add up all of these mentions to the real world, they don't amount to 57. So it's certainly less than the total population. Some economists, like Milton Friedman, advocate falsification as a strategy. Falsification, you put a hypothesis, you compare it to the real world. If the real world does not agree, then you abandon the hypothesis. This is used to be supposed to be a kind of gold standard. I don't think anyone takes it seriously anymore for all sorts of reasons, but that used to confer some respectability on economics as an empirical enterprise. But as I hinted, methodologists are the sort of people who spend their time worrying about how economics ought to be done. And they have thrown the idea of testing hypotheses completely by the wayside. Nobody, I think, in the methodology of economics advocates confronting the theory with evidence. Well, there are 3 holdovers. There are a few holdovers from the olden days, but on the whole, that kind of discourse has completely gone out of the window. And the focus in economics is on modeling, is on constructing very simple constructs. And the reason for this is reality is too complicated. Well, that might be one interpretation. Another interpretation is that maybe the theory is inadequate. Maybe we don't have the right models. I'm just throwing these possibilities up in the air. So we said economics is normative. What are the norms of economics? The norm of economics is efficiency. Now, there are all sorts of things that we might aspire to. Truth, beauty, harmony, peace, elegance. There are all sorts of things that we might aspire to, but economics is about efficiency. But the efficiency of economics is not what you think efficiency is. So when ordinary people talk about efficiency, they think it's about getting more for less. Yes, that's a colloquial sense of what efficiency is, but not in economics. And I should mention a common rhetorical trick in economics, which is you take a common word, you use it in a technical sense, and then you smuggle that word back into ordinary discourse with this altered meaning that you have given to it. So you say efficiency actually doesn't mean what you think it means something else. And then we go back into the street and start using the word efficiency again, saying efficiency does this, efficiency does that, but not in the way you think it is, but in the way they think it is, or we think it is. Hence, an efficient market economy is not an economy that provides the most for the least. That's not what it means. What it means is it's an economy in which all markets have cleared, in which there is no slack, And this is called Pareto Efficiency. No individual can benefit without harming someone else. That's the condition in which, if all resources are engaged, if there's no slack, then for me to get better off, you have to be worse off. That's the ideal situation because there's no scope for any further costless improvement. However, and this sounds nice, this sounds agreeable, except that it has some attributes which are not universally celebrated. For example, it underpins the status quo. So if the only way to get a change is to harm somebody, we need that person's permission. That means that every person has a veto on every social change. We cannot, for example, let's imagine, build a road or build a hospital without someone having to pay more tax, and therefore that has to be agreed upon. Yes, so that's a kind of recipe for not doing things. This state of efficiency. Now, I said that this blissful state of affairs arises when people interact, exercising their choice in unfettered markets. Why do we think markets are so good? Well, the faith in markets comes from economics, but this is, I think, most of what is going to be my critique of economics, the rest of this slide. I'll just say, and I'm happy to get challenged on this statement. So the doctrines are not well founded. The doctrine, individual self-interest, does not scale up to the invisible hand. There is a formal result, which is way over my head, but I have it on good authority that you cannot go from individual self-interest to an invisible hand kind of result. These are called the Sonnenschein-Mantel-de-Bro results of the 1970s. The premises are unrealistic. I've already presented you with the premises. The models are inconsistent. The predictions are often wrong. And they lead to harmful policies, like, for example, we've seen in the last 10 years or so, financial disorder, rising inequality, all arose in a world which is largely governed by economic thinking. Maybe the theory, Feynman might say, maybe the theory is just wrong. That's a possibility which I think we want to leave on the table. Okay. Economics has a kind of partner in the political arena, which I call market liberalism. Market liberalism is a just world theory. What is a just world theory? Just world theory is a class of theories which say everyone gets what they deserve. There are quite a few theories of that kind. You can start thinking about them. For example, many religions think that everyone gets what they deserve, or ought to get what they deserve. Various forms of discrimination are based on the premise that everyone gets what they deserve. This particular form of a just world theory is theorized in neoclassical economics. Neoclassical economics is the intellectual system, the model that I've described briefly before. So this is also scientific. So this is a Nobel Prize ceremony. Milton Friedman, who I suppose stands more for this kind of thinking than perhaps anyone else, receiving the Nobel Prize from the King of Sweden. And so what are the ideas? First, entitlements arise from labor and from ownership of property rights, however acquired. So everyone has something to sell. That's the basic idea. In the world of economics, everyone has something to sell. Either ownership of labor or ownership of property rights. And we don't ask how they got it. We don't ask how come this person has property or rights over property, how come this person has whatever skills they sell in the labor market. These entitlements are properly earned. No one owes anybody anything. So here's Milton Friedman. So this is a system of ethics. And this is Milton Friedman on what the ethics of this are. The ethical principle that would directly justify the distribution of income in a free market society is, and the quote is, to each according to what he and the instruments he owns produces. So you will hear the faint echo of Karl Marx here. To each, yes, according, not what you thought, but what he and the so it's both labor and ownership which generates the entitlement. What people bring into the market, their inheritance and their initial endowments, is ethically deserved. We don't query that. What they take out, therefore, is also ethically deserved. So this is a doctrine of inequality. The free market economy is both efficient and it is also just. We can think of it as a natural order. Since it's a natural order, it is futile to resist. That's the market liberal creed. Now, does that mean that economists are conservative? So I wondered about that. And so we applied our instrument of counting citations and counting heads. And this is what we got. So we divided economists into liberal and conservative in deference to our publisher, which is based in the United States. So liberals in the States are on the left, and, well, conservatives, there's no problem. But in Europe, liberals are often on the right, of course. So liberals on the left, and our definition of a liberal economist is an economist that thinks that market can sometimes fail. And if markets fail, that might require a social intervention of some kind to correct the operation of markets. Conservatives don't think that markets can ever fail. They think that markets produce optimal results at all time. And if they fail, it's only because of these misguided interventions. So, this is the graph. Yes, in deference again to American practice, the blue is the left and the red is the right. And you can see that, a bit like the empiricists and the formalists, the first thing to see is that they're quite evenly matched. There's a difference of sorts, but they move up more or less together. The liberals have more citations. There aren't more of them, actually. Well, there are more of them, but only one more. This is the table, the numbers, 26 and 25. If you're calculating quickly that it doesn't come up to 57, you're right. I left some people out. And in terms of citations, the liberals have a few more citations, so they're slightly more heavily quoted. You can also see that there is a period in the early period, the liberals predominated, but the conservatives were always there in smaller numbers. And then from around 1990, they had a very good run, an unbroken run for about 7 years. And they caught up, and they even, did they overtake? No, they never overtook. But you can see that on the whole, the numbers are more or less evenly matched. Now, what does that tell us? Does that tell us that economics are evenly matched between the left and the right, or maybe the Nobel Committee is committed to a balance? We needed to answer that question, And fortunately, we had another way of gauging this. So how would we know whether this result is biased or not? Biased in relation to what? Well, one thing to compare it with is opinion within the economics discipline, looking at real economists, not just those who win these prizes. And it turns out that there have been a succession of surveys over the years which ask more or less the same questions over a very long period of time. The first one is the United States in 1976, and then there's one in Europe in 81-2, USA 1990, UK 1990, USA 2000. There have been more since, but the great advantage is that they use more or less the same set of questions. So I've selected 3 questions which should give us an insight. One is, should there be more equality? The second is, should government expenditure be reduced? And the third is, do you support social insurance? And I've arranged it so that the left is on the left and the right is on the right. And a cursory look, say that's more equality, you can see that, yes, this is agree, this is half agree, this is indifferent, this is half disagree, and this is completely disagree. So you can see that basically there are 2 columns on the left for every column on the right. That's more or less the pattern. Just to avoid excessive consistency in this discipline, you can see that people are in favor of more equality and more social insurance, I mean economies, but they're not in favor of more government expenditure. So that's a blow for consistency. So, the first thing is that there isn't a single view. Economies are divided. And they're divided approximately 2/3 to one side and 1/3 to the other. They're actually inclined towards social democracy. They're actually inclined towards the left rather than towards the right, which is maybe consistent with their social position as being usually employees of wage earners, as it were, in institutions supported by the government. So you'd expect them to be inclined towards the left. 1/3 neoliberals, 2/3 social democratic in terms of the values that they express. And going further, there have been other surveys. So the leadership of the American Economic Association is much more liberal than the rank and file. The rank and file are also very liberal. They vote for the Democrats 3-1. But they're only left-wing after hours, as it were. On the day job, they're all loyal marketeers. And so I would argue that the real dividing line lies not between the left and the right among economists, but between economics and social democracy. In the longer version of this talk, I explain what alternative social democracy provides, but let's leave it to one side here. I think this is an important point, that there's only one social democrat, only one believer, practitioner of actual social democracy who ever won a Nobel Prize, and that is only because he was a Swede, and he was the most senior social scientist in Sweden. You couldn't leave him out. He's actually on the jacket of the book with his wife, who also won a Nobel Prize, and that is Gunnar Myrdal. So, social democratic economists don't offer theoretical support for social democracy. They're loyal marketeers on the whole. Where did the Nobel Prize come from? It came along rather late in the day. It came out of exactly this struggle between social democracy and the market view of things. Not from Alfred Nobel in 1895, it was only established in 1968. And it goes back to a debate within Swedish government, within Swedish social democracy, in that they prioritize employment and housing over stable prices. The social democratic government, Sweden had a social democratic government unbroken between 1932 and 1976. But the Swedish central bank, like most central banks, didn't like this, especially since it was actually called to lend money to the government. to build housing. This is a practice which the European Union, for example, has outlawed, actually running the budget on central bank loans, in other words, printing money. And so they unilaterally raise interest rates. They're quickly put in their place by the government, but the bank needed to save face, if only to maintain its credibility, so they're given some compensation, and the last installment of this compensation was this Nobel Prize, which they set up about 10 years after this event, as a kind of vanity project for the bank. It set up a committee of economists. These economists are consistently inclined towards the right among Swedish economists. Let me skip this whole thing. There's a debate in Sweden which continues. At any rate, the prestige of Nobel Prize committee members and of Nobel Prize winners supported the market-friendly reforms which Sweden, like pretty much every other social democratic party, every other government, began to institute from the 1980s onwards. So I don't think it's fair to blame the Nobel Prize for this, because it happened everywhere. Okay, now we're changing gear. So looking at what economics is about, going back to the story of what economics is about. So the kind of economics which I described previously was a harmony theory. Remember, everyone pursues their self-interest, and the consequence is an optimal state of society. That's a harmony theory. There's no real conflicts of interest. This is quite attractive in the interwar years, when taxation was low. So what are you complaining about? This is the best we can hope for. And so therefore the economics of that time essentially justified the status quo. Now, this economics that I described, the equilibrium market economics, has a hidden premise of good faith. Everyone acts in good faith. There's no cheating. And the other is costless enforcement. Everything happens on its own. People meet to exchange goods and so on. No one ever cheats. There's no need for law. There's no need for police. In fact, there's no need for government. There's no government in that model. So the equilibrium theory I described justifies the low tax interwar status quo. And then we have the Second World War. And after the Second World War, there's no longer low tax. There's a shift to high tax social democracy. And therefore, there are important groups in economics which strive to restore the pre-war or the interwar status quo. The outstanding figure there is Friedrich von Hayek. The first shot, even while the war is going on, the road to serfdom. He then sets up a Monetarism society, which is a kind of annual meeting of like-minded academics, journalists, intellectuals in general, to discuss restoring the interwar status quo. Friedman comes in with Capitalism and Freedom, Buchanan and Tallack, the Calculus of Consent. These are all heavyweight interventions in the intellectual debate, questioning, challenging the post-war social democratic move. They resist the new status quo, so there's a new social democratic status quo. They don't like it. They want the old one back, and all of them get a Nobel Prize. So 8 members of the Monetarism Society are honored with a Nobel Prize, including all the people listed, except Tallack for some reason. Actually, I think I know why I didn't get it. You can ask why later. So they all get a Nobel Prize. And from 1970s, the issue of taxation moves to the heart of politics. And this pushback is successful. So the very high marginal tax rates of the post-war period are rolled back from the 1980s onwards. By the way, not the level of taxation overall. The level of taxation remains more or less as it was, but the high marginal tax rates on the wealthy, these are the things that are rolled back. So, for example, the new status quo, high taxation. This is the post-war years. You can see extremely high marginal rates. This is the top income tax rate, very close to 100% in Britain, United States, not very far below. So they start falling quite steeply around 1980. And this is inequality. So this is a measure of the income share of the top 1%. And you can see it falling. These are all from the famous work of Piketty and his contributor and his collaborators. So you can see their share falling from around 20% to around between, say, 6 and 8%, and then starting to rise again in 1980. So what I'm suggesting here is that partly this is a policy response to a cogent argument against high tax rates. I'd like to show another piece of technology that we use here. We call these the Bass curves. So one of the questions we wanted to ask using citations, one of the questions we wanted to ask is at what point does a person get a Nobel Prize? Do they get a prize for their promise, or do they get a prize for their achievement? What happens after they get the prize? Do they become more productive, or perhaps they rest on their laurels? Well, we've come up with a very clear result. This Bass curve is a mathematical formula for measuring the diffusion of innovations. It's found its greatest use in predicting the diffusion of household appliances. So it's widely used in marketing to predict how successful, say, a new washing machine is going to be. I won't go into how it's done, but the Nobel Prize is also, or let's put it this way, the work of any particular economist is also like a different model of a washing machine in the sense that it is an innovation. And you can see how well, what you can see, so this is Samuelson, who I suppose can be regarded as one of the very top emblematic economists of the post-war years. This is his cumulative citations. What we have here is, well, it's the pre-Nobel, this is the post-Nobel, this is, and the broken line is the Bass curve prediction. So it's uncannily accurate. I'm cheating a bit here because Samuelson gives us just about the best result, but all of them give a pretty good result. This is a really good model. And the other thing is that, so this is the typical innovation diffusion cumulative curve, which has an S shape, and if you turn that to the annual curve, which is this, it has a bell shape. So it goes up, it peaks, and then it comes down, and Samuelson fits the bill just perfectly. This is not an accident. You can see if we do this for all winners, we get the same result. So this is for all Nobel Prize winners. This is the actual result, the mean, and this is the Bass curve. There's a little bit of a bonus, a prize bonus. This is when they get the prize, this line. So there's a bit of a bonus, and then they start declining, mostly because they're pretty old by then. So it's not as if they rest on their laurels. Now, there's one exception to this. In this whole cohort, 57 people, there's one exception to this, and that's Friedrich von Hayek. So Friedrich von Hayek is, I should point out, by the way, that these curves are scaled differently. This is, Hayek goes only up to 30 here, and Samuelson goes up to 100, so Hayek is much less cited than Samuelson ever is. Sorry, the other way around. Then Hayek is much less cited than Samuelson. And you can see that from the 30s to the 70s, he kind of bumps along the bottom. This is the actual level of citation that he gets, and this is on this axis and on this axis, which is a lower one. These are his, this is his Bass curve. So it peaks sometime in the 60s and it's in decline, and then he gets a Nobel Prize. And you can see what an enormous boost is associated with the prize. I won't say the prize gave him that boost, although his biography said it did. But certainly he is suddenly much more visible. And this is also precisely the point at which Samuelson's post-war neoclassical synthesis, Keynesian, welfare state, all of that sort begins to go out of fashion. So Samuelson declines pretty rapidly. Okay. So you can see that harmony might have worked between the wars, but the social democratic system of high taxation did not strike a large number of economists as particularly harmonious, and so they came up with a new set of doctrines, which I call bad faith doctrines. So their observation is that if previously people got what they deserve under social democracy, people appeared to get what they didn't deserve, scroungers and all that. And so we have a set of bad faith doctrines. We no longer assume that people act in good faith in the harmonious equilibrium economy, but that they act in bad faith, and that the norm is no longer good faith. The norm is actually cheating. The expectation is that everyone will cheat, and if the expectation is that everyone will cheat, then you have to cheat as well in order to survive in that kind of world. And these doctrines mostly come under the head of asymmetric information doctrine. So one of the attributes of the previous equilibrium model was that every agent was perfectly informed. They actually knew what was available in the market and what the prices were, not only now but for all time. Now a dose of realism is imported, and that dose of realism is asymmetric information. Some people know more than other people. And there's a whole range of doctrines of that kind, which I'll simply list. Those of you who know them will recognize them. Those who don't, this is not the occasion to start unpacking them. But what they all characterize is that in an exchange, one side knows more than the other side, and there's a position to take advantage of that superior knowledge. Yes, so, just read it off the screen. The one I like is from Oliver Williamson, who comes up again with the norm that when you go into the marketplace, you should assume that your counterparty will be motivated by opportunism with guile. So these are the doctrines, and they're all of them recognized by Nobel Prizes. So all of these doctrines are recognized, all of these doctrines are celebrated in the way that, you know, the King of Sweden shakes the hand and hands over a check. Now, there is a problem with bad faith economics, which is that it's indeterminate. In other words, in standard equilibrium economics, the result is optimal. The result is the best that can be. That's Pareto efficiency, Pareto optimality. But in bad faith economics, the result is indeterminate. It depends on how well you cheat. You know, if two cheats meet and try to trade, one of them will be cheating better than the other. And therefore, we cannot say that the outcome is optimal. That is a problem. So the outcomes depend on cheating. And the consequence is that economics stops being normative. That's a very high price to pay. So economics can no longer tell us what to do except to tell us to cheat as well as you can. Everyone is acting in bad faith, fortunately except for economists. Economists are the last bastion of good faith. And Chicago comes up with an approach which is an attempt to save equilibrium economics. I call this the Chicago feint. These are market clearing doctrines which argue that policy is ineffective, intervention is ineffective. We saw that that assumption was there from the start, but there's a new set of doctrines. One is monetarism. Again, I'm going to list them because there's always more than one. Monetarism, Ricardian equivalence, rational expectations, Coe's theorem, efficient market hypothesis in finance. What unites all of these doctrines is that social intervention is futile because the market is more clever than the guardians, as it were, or the people who will intervene. So the best policy is no policy. And again, this all gets recognized with Nobel Prizes. All of these doctrines receive Nobel Prizes. One of the most important ones is the doctrine of optimal taxation, put forward by James Mirrlees, which justifies the lowering of marginal tax rates, indeed a flat tax instead of progressive taxation. Mirrlees exemplifies another thing. So in his personal beliefs, he's a person I actually knew. He was a colleague of mine. And in his personal values, he was a social democrat, but he's also a mathematician, and he followed his assumption wherever they led. And his flat tax disabled social democracy is based on high tax levels. So although he is a social democrat in his beliefs, his analysis leads to a recommendation for low tax rates. I'll just show you how this approach outsmarts social democracy. So this is Mirrlees. 1996 is when he gets a Nobel Prize. The doctrine itself is developed in the early 70s. This is the most normative of all Nobel lectures. I read all the Nobel lectures. They all have to give a paper after they get the prize. So I read all of them. And this is the most prescriptive, the most normative. So the tax level is framed entirely as an equity efficiency trade-off. In other words, you can have either high efficiency or high levels of equity, but not both. In other words, he refused to think of tax as perhaps a form of insurance policy, which is another way of thinking about social expenditure. Only the market provides welfare. These are assumptions. The premises are entirely orthodox: market clearing, Arrow de Breu, asymmetric information. Oh yes, but there's one twist, which is asymmetric information. So everything is orthodox except the assumption of asymmetric information. And the particular asymmetric information is that government cannot know how much effort people are putting in. Taxation inevitably causes a deadweight loss. So let's take this, the standard kind of analysis. So quantity price, we raise the tax, and welfare declines, and this triangle is called the Harberger triangle. It's a deadweight loss, so it reduces welfare just through taxation because it inhibits market exchange. There's a lot of fancy maths there, way over my head, but the intuition is quite simple, which is that progressive taxation induces a withdrawal of effort. That's intuitively, that's not outrageous, I think. And so the recommendation is a flat tax, low marginal tax rates, and no taxes or low taxes on capital gains. Very much the conservative prescription, but it has to be said that these are not findings, because Millis did not investigate anything. You know, this all started from premises and ended with conclusions, with no intervention of evidence in any of this. So its whole prescriptive power arises from the analysis. If we actually look at what happened, well, how plausible is this? So let's look at healthcare. Market healthcare in the United States, twice as costly as tax finance NHS and less effective in terms of outcomes. So this is USA healthcare, more expensive, NHS and more quantity, but in this case more quantity is not an advantage. You get more healthcare than you need. NHS, less healthcare, but the results are the same or better. We know that countries with high inequality and low taxes are neither wealthier nor happier than countries which are equal and have high levels of taxation. It all depends on the premises. So Merlis recommended a top marginal tax rate of 0, and he always went around saying, look at how paradoxical this is, that the richest people should have a marginal tax rate of 0, and my mathematics shows this, even if you can't follow it. However, other people, for example, Peter Diamond, who also got the Nobel Prize, in fact wrote the original papers together with Merlis, has recently recommended a marginal rate of 78%, sorry, it should be 73%, and Christine Romer, who's also a well-known economist, recommended 80%. So it all depends on the premises you put into the analysis. But Merlis has had an impact on policy. It was hired by David Cameron to review taxation, and that review recommended the kind of tax lowering measures that followed. So optimal taxation undermines social, democratic, progressive taxation, natural transfer strategy. You know, we're running out of time, aren't we? Yeah. So I'll skip this slide. And say something briefly about what has happened to economics since 2005 when we stopped. So the first thing is an empirical revolution. So during the years of the Nobel Prize, the highest prestige went to the theories. And I mentioned this, although in terms of citations, overall theory got about half the citations. Since the beginning of this century, there's been a big shift in economics, away from economic theory towards pure empiricism, based on a kind of medical model of treatment and effect with a control group. And that is probably the biggest field today. Experiments of various kinds, lab experiments, field experiments, natural experiments, historical experiments, all of which apply this treatment effect model. There's a general waning of general equilibrium thinking, and even a dissolution of this kind of left-right demarcation. I think this is really more associated with the high noon of high theory. There's also a surge of alternative and heterodox doctrines. For example, modern monetary theory, a revival of the classics. Even Henry George is occasionally mentioned. You know, we are guests in his mansion here. So this is a citation diagram of some of the greats of the past, and you can see that by far the most cited economist ever is Adam Smith, and rising up to new heights. And the second most cited economist is actually Karl Marx. So the classics have come back, and the Adam Smith that's been cited is not the Adam Smith of the Mont Pelerin Society. It's updated, humanized theory of moral sentiments kind of Adam Smith. In terms of the various things that economists do, it's very difficult to read. What comes out of this is the various sub-disciplines. And what you can see here, the deep blue columns are the number of winners, and the light blue columns are the number of citations. So you can see there's quite a good match here between the number of citations and the number of winners. And I'll just read what they are. So market clearing, equilibrium, and finance. This is basically right-wing economics. Neoclassical Keynesian, that's kind of left-wing. This is just market clearing, equilibrium, very similar to the Keynesians. Institutional, during this period, this is mostly development economics and economic history. Econometrics, finance, behavioral, game theory, and national accounting. So everyone gets recognized more or less according to the volume of citations. Although the Nobel Committee says they don't count citations, the way they select the winners suggests that somehow or other their selection criteria match the volume of citations, except for game theory, which is underrepresentative. Sorry, overrepresented. Yeah, yes, they're overrepresented, and econometrics is also overrepresented. Now, much of this activity is not recognized by Nobel Prizes. So none of the heterodox economics has been recognized, although in the New York Times yesterday or the day before yesterday, there's an article attacking modern monetary theory. So if it's already salient enough to be attacked by Krugman and by Summers, that suggests that it's broken some kind of barrier to recognition. What has the Nobel Committee recognized? Well, they have quite a new focus on what I call analytical institutional economics, mechanism design. So this is a retreat from the level of general equilibrium to the level of how we can make institutions work more effectively. The classic example of this is auction design. But there are other things of that kind, and you can see that this is the new sliced bread, this analytical institutional economics. All the rest are marking time, really. I'd say both Keynesian and equilibrium are basically in the process of disappearing. Most of these people did their work a very long time ago. And so we've reached a conclusion. The conclusion is that, first, what is the Nobel Prize about? I would argue that the main objective of the Nobel Committee is to maintain the credibility of the prize. That is best explanation of the way they grant it, in that they choose people at the top of their game. They try to cover everything that's going on. They want the profession to think well of them, and the profession does think well of them. I think they've succeeded in that. The prize is credible. In order to do so, they maintain a mechanical balance between the right and the left, the formal and the empirical, and the various sub-disciplines, each one in their turn. They maintain a scientific pretension. In other words, it has to look like science. It has to be mathematical. It has to be abstruse. there is a high premium on cleverness in the prize. There have been exceptions. Literary economists, there are three literary economists, Hyde, Buchanan, Coase. I suppose, as I see this, I see that I'm wrong. Because Myrdal is also a literary economist, and he also got it, and he's on the list. So I should really take that back. Now, what I'm trying to get at in this talk is that whatever validity economics has, it is not the validity of science. And if one accepts that, then it's no better, and perhaps no worse than any other form of special pleading. In other words, there's no scientific substitute for normative debate. Science will not get us out of our various predicaments. There's no formula. Economics has a great deal to contribute, but it is not entitled to a privileged hearing. And I've reached the end of the talk. Thank you very much.
A little bit, but you had a lot of very interesting material. So, we've got about 25 minutes for questions and discussion. We've got loads of sort of batch of three. I'll take you.
Thank you.
Can you say your name?
Yes, my name is Alejandro. I work in blockchain and disruptive technologies, and the question is related to it. For the next Nobel winners prize economists that you think that could win the prize, what is the role of technology and disruptive technology in the creation or in the advancement of economics as a science and practice?
Well, the main thing is the adoption of computing power. Computing power has allowed this, what I call the empirical term, which involves the analysis of large amounts of data, or involves the analysis of data full stop. So in that respect, I think the change in style from this kind of high theorizing, factless type of economics that used to be extremely prestigious, that has been facilitated by the availability of computing power.
So looking at your patents since 2005, most were institutionalized. So do you think in the future we could have more machine people, with what's a top machine learning economist?
The very first Nobel Prize winner in economics was Ragnar Frisch, who was a econometrician, and he was actually a social democrat. So he said the job of the economist is to find out what the politicians want and to program it and to feed it to computers who will then calculate the optimal answer. And this trope has recurs several times in the Nobel Prize speeches. Several people hold out. By the way, Milton Friedman, with his Milton Friedman's monetarism was also a kind of automatic machine for maintaining the money supply at optimal levels. So he said that the central bank should increase the money supply at a steady rate of growth every year, so that it be entirely predictable, everyone will know it, and so on, and there's no need for any kind of policy intervention. That's another notion that you can somehow automate policy making. His assumption, of course, was that the central bank created money, but that's something that we have doubts about these days.
I find your conclusions depressingly true. I mean, it is awful the way we have so much inequality in the economy. I mean, your figures of distribution of wealth between the rich and the poor. I mean, where can we get somewhere towards a bit more equality and a bit more fairness? And certainly the happiest countries are those where incomes are more equally distributed. So Why are we all dominated by greed and selfishness?
Well, if you ask an economist, and I'm saying this in what I hope is a completely neutral way, is an economist would say that is as it should be. So
That is what, sorry?
that is as it should be. So the basic premise is that everyone pursues their own self-interest. Self-interest for convenience is usually considered to be maximizing either money or income or something tangible and so on, and that will lead to the optimal state. Now, I think that this mindset has dominated policy for the last 40 years. The assumption was that if we leave markets alone, we're going to do as well as we can do. The one mystery in this is why the market sector the public sector has remained so large throughout. So it's no smaller now than it was 40 years ago. And this is something I've dealt with in other contexts. And my answer to that is that if we want certain things to be done, there's no other way of doing it. In other words, there's a whole set of things which the market simply cannot do. Some things it can do badly, some things it cannot do at all. And that's why, despite the public sector, social democracy, whatever you want to call it, having no advocates in either the academy, journalism, or politics, is nevertheless impossible to get rid of. So my answer was to say that to the extent that we are indeed focused on, you call it greed. Greed is actually a colloquial term for one of the auxiliary, not quite an axiom in economics, but the assumption is that in economics is that everyone wants more rather than less. So that's kind of baked into the premise, and so long as that is the dominant normative system, I think that's what it is. Then maybe that is the result we're bound to get.
The normative becomes actually reflects reality, or we become reflecting the theory.
Well, of course, if we go on until we've increasing GDP all the time, we shall run out of all sorts of resources and nobody will have anything.
I couldn't disagree with that, yes.
Let's, we'll give it, sorry.
I was,
Your name? Sorry.
sorry, Dennis Leach from Warwick University. I was struck by your use of the term economics in a sense, a much narrower sense than the way in which it was used when I was a student. And perhaps the definition of economics has changed in a sort of coincidentally with the Nobel Prize. But economics used to be much broader. It wasn't just about market efficiency, the sort of Robbins definition. It was also macroeconomics. Macroeconomics and microeconomics, when I was a student, are very different methodologies and concerned with very different subject matters. I mean, Keynesian economics is not concerned with, it doesn't assume that free markets lead to efficiency. Quite the opposite. Macroeconomics today, of course, is very different from what it was then. But seems to me that we ought to use the word economics in the broadest sense to embrace the study of man in the ordinary business of life. I think was a definition used a long time ago by Marshall, I think.
Marshall.
Yeah, and maybe it would be nice, I think, if we were to continue to do that rather than simply to focus on efficiency, but also to look at macroeconomics in the sort of what I think of as proper macroeconomics, Keynesian macroeconomics.
Well, my conception of economics is as it was practiced by the winners of the Nobel Prize during this period. And the Nobel starts in 1969, and by that time Keynesian macro is on the wane. It's already encountered the challenge of inflation, for which it doesn't have a convincing answer. And the Keynesian insight has been converted into a market-friendly version by Samuelson called the neoclassical synthesis. So although some of the creators are certainly recognized and continue to be active for a while, that particular stream in economics moves out of respectability. And the neo-Keynesians, so-called, have much more in common with Chicago than with Cambridge, England.
So has just that recent stage where you've got institutionalists, and also you point to the interest in people looking at experiments and so forth, has that changed at all the underlying fundamental propositions, or are these people just moving into this space but maintaining those basic principles?
I think we need to separate the two. I think the experimental movement is a renunciation of economic theory. It's independent of economic theory. The theory that they invoke is statistical theory. Goes back to Rothamsted, to the medical model, to the agricultural model, and really makes very little reference to economics at all.
And they're not really winning Nobel Prizes, this lot?
No, they're not. I think the only person of that description who's won a prize is James Heckman, and he cannot be ignored because he is the champion of citations, really, in the post-2000 years. So he is so dominant. But otherwise, the Nobel Committee has completely ignored that movement. I find that quite extraordinary. Now, I'm always waiting for the next prize to be awarded to one of these people. The other one, I think, has been excessively over-rewarded, and that is an attempt to save, I think, mythological individualism. Not the invisible hand, but to save mythological individualism, because the equilibria that are achieved in these models are partial equilibrium rather than general equilibrium.
And which one, sorry, where are they being saved?
These are the analytical institutions.
Oh, so the analytical institutionalists are actually trying to keep to
That's right.
the mainstream rather than...
That's right, yeah.
Okay.
But what they're maintaining is the traditional behavioral assumptions.
Hi, I'm Robert Diller from the Center of Internal Finance and Economics. Just thinking back again to what I mentioned earlier about the roots of economics. In ancient Greek, of course, economics was the science, or let's say the management of the household. So in a sense, economics, the roots are, it's a social science, to my understanding. And we mentioned GDP earlier, and we mentioned one of the sort of winners here, which was a very Western dominated. Sort of thinking from a very sort of almost a purely Western perspective on economic dynamics, but at the same time we have things like good economics, we have alternative forms of economics thinking, which hasn't really had a voice. So to what extent do you believe or think that that is maybe something which is coming? Or do you believe that there might be an alternative, which there is, there is now the alternative Nobel Prize, that would have to kind of start to champion the alternative views and move away from the traditional Western paradigm?
Well, the focus of this talk was on the Nobel Prize, and that is the pinnacle of a tight intellectual monopoly, which is focused on a small number of institutions, a small number of journals, which lay down the normative rules for how to do economics. And to the extent that, and so the prize has an important role in maintaining that monopoly or that type of hegemony. And it's interesting that they don't let in the empiricists. They have let in the behaviorists. That was actually because the behaviorists are undermine the assumptions, perhaps even more than the experimentalists do. So they've given a few prizes to the behaviorists.
Why is that, do you think? Why that? Because that, if you take that seriously, you couldn't draw a demand curve. You know,
Why? I'm not entirely sure. There are not that many. There are only 3 actually in my period. So one is Herbert Simon. Herbert Simon, there are many ways to think about him. But I think what was very important is that he was a citation giant. So he is, I think, number 3 in overall citations. He's very, very high in citations. And someone probably said it's time that we acknowledge this. And the next time they did it was in 2001, 2002, when they gave it to Kahneman and Vernon Smith. Vernon Smith, so Kahneman was in effect neutralized by Smith. So Smith's project has been to show that in experimental setting the results converge on orthodox market equilibrium. So in that respect, I'm not saying that choosing him was not justified. I think he's a very, very considerable scholar, and his Nobel lecture is one of the very best. And he actually points out the example, although he states this result again and again. He did experiments on animals as well, on pigeons, showing that you don't even have to be smart to be a good economist. But the main experiment he describes is actually one in which people are not motivated by self-interest, they're motivated by reciprocity. It's a very interesting experiment. But that's a subset, just 3.
Andrew Ross, you began your fascinating talk with a question about what is economics about, basically, and the epistemological approach, like what's the nature of reality, is maybe the big question that isn't being asked by economics, because if market failure requires government intervention, what we can see with climate change is market failure on a colossal scale, with governments almost incapable of solving. So if it's an economics problem to deal with this, how do you envisage the role of natural capital economics in this situation, and the way in which our government in particular is looking at auctions for public money for public goods and to provide ecosystem services? And your colleague in this question, your colleague Dieter Helm, do you think he's up for the Nobel Prize?
You managed to link. I wondered how you were going to link it to the Nobel Prize then.
Yeah, well, the epistemological aspect of this is what's the best way to think about the economy. And what economists tell us is let us start from the premise of unfettered markets. So the whole concept of government failure, of market failure, implies that the point of departure is markets. But when we actually look out of the window, that's not necessarily what we see. So if you actually start adding up the sources of economic welfare, typically governments allocate about 45%, between 40 and 50% of GDP. Not-for-profits another 5 to 15%. The household does not operate on a market basis, but it produces the labor force. Where does the labor force come from, you know? In the standard models, the labor force is just out there. So when you estimate the size of the household economy, that's between 20 and 30% of the GDP figure. So overall, only a minority of economic welfare comes from private entities, for-profit entities. Now, if you look at how these for-profit entities, I would say that most of that activity is carried out in conditions of what I call a social franchise. So various forms of quasi-monopoly which are granted in effect by society. You know, think of the railway companies as an example. Think of, well, we don't have to go very far. Look at the banking system. Now, the banking system is utterly dependent on central banking, on an implicit bailout guarantee, on a licensing system, on clearing systems which are authorized and regulated and so on. So you have very little free competition left. Free competition produces smartphones, produces cars, you know. There are certain characteristics of where free competition is optimal. And they're responsible for lots of good things. But these lots of good things are a fairly small fraction of total economic welfare.
And if you take Mariana Mazzucato famously showing that smartphones mainly come from the industrial military complex and innovation there, don't they?
Yeah.
Well,
How do I envisage natural capital? Well, here again, you know, I think that we are already captive to the economic way of thinking by calling it capital. So capital implies that this is a resource that is valued by its discounted revenue stream. If you think in these terms, then at any reasonable rate of interest, you don't care about what happens to it in 20 years' time. You know? So once again, we're captive to a particular way of thinking. There are ways of getting around this. For example, there is a movement which I think now is has been marginalized to some extent, of extending the national accounts to include resource depletion. And when you look at that, it shows that we're not getting richer, we're actually getting poorer. As to what should be done, this is where the Nobel Prize does come in, actually. So the Nobel Prize, the last Nobel Prize is being given to an environmental economist, to Nordhaus, but I think it's been given to the wrong person. Because Nordhaus's solution is actually calculated, I think, to cause a lot of damage. It's also, I think, if I may say so, with all due deference and so on, I haven't received the Nobel Prize, I'm not even a candidate. Nevertheless, I think that his approach is wrong-headed, because what it boils down to, essentially, is to say that in valuing what we call natural capital, we should use market rates of discount. I think this is completely wrong-headed for a variety of reasons, and the British economist, Nicholas Stern, suggested that we should have very low discount rates, and there are many, many reasons for thinking that that is the sounder approach. So, but on the other hand, the committee has been consistent in selecting. Sorry? The Nobel Committee has been consistent in holding out the possibility of a market solution for this kind of problem.
That is that consistent. Well, that is not a bad place actually to wind up and move on to having a glass of wine, because actually first I want to talk about where we're going next with this project. We might start by actually thanking Avner Offer very much for a very fascinating paper.